The Galactic Academy's Advanced Xenobiology lecture hall was a marvel of modern architecture, with its crystalline walls that adjusted their opacity based on the varying light sensitivity needs of its diverse student body. Today they were set to a soft amber tint that made Professor Nick's Quantum's gelatinous form cast fascinating shadows across the room as he concluded his lecture. And that concludes our overview of the Zentarian spine worm, the professor announced, his translucent body wobbling with what could only be described as academic smugness. Each ripple in his form created prismatic patterns that would have been mesmerizing if Kelvin Parker wasn't so thoroughly done with the whole presentation. A truly magnificent example of evolutionary perfection. The professor continued, several small bubbles of academic excitement forming and popping at his upper extremity. Kelvin, the only human in Advanced Xenobiology 401, fought the urge to roll his eyes, a gesture he'd learned most alien species found either confusing or mildly offensive. The spine worm was, in his entirely professional opinion, basically a glorified earthworm with delusions of grandeur and a party trick. But that was typical of the Galactic Academy. Everything non-Earth was automatically deemed magnificent, extraordinary, or his personal favorite, evolutionarily supreme. He glanced around the lecture hall at his classmates, each a testament to the diversity of life in the galaxy. Most were taking dutiful notes through various means, some using standard holographic interfaces, others employing species-specific methods. The vapoids in the back were absorbing information directly through their gaseous outer layers, while the silicon-based crystallians seemed to be encoding data directly into their lattice structure. Directly to his left, Glex the Zentarian was practically preening, their crystalline scales shifting through various shades of iridescent blue, in what Kelvin had come to recognize as their species' version of smug satisfaction. Of course, they were proud it was their species' native fauna being discussed, and Glex never missed an opportunity to remind everyone of Zentarian superiority. Now then, Professor Nick's Quantum continued, his entire form pulsing with academic fervor. Who can tell me the primary hunting method of the spine worm? And please, let's have someone other than. Ah, never mind. Glex's hand had already shot up so fast it created a small sonic boom, their scales now practically strobing with excitement. The spine worm utilizes a complex form of psychic intimidation to paralyze its prey, obviously. They announced, managing to sound both correct and condescending simultaneously. It's widely acknowledged as the most advanced hunting technique in the known galaxy, combining both mental domination and energy efficiency. Excellent. Excellent, the professor's praise emerged in perfectly formed spheres that floated upward before dissipating. The psychological dominance exhibited by our apex predators is truly remarkable. The subtle elegance of psychic hunting strategies demonstrates the heights of evolutionary advancement. Unlike some planets' more primitive approaches. That pointed pause, accompanied by a slight shift in the professor's coloring toward the ultraviolet spectrum, was definitely aimed at Kelvin. Ever since he'd enrolled in the exchange program, there had been this underlying assumption that Earth's wildlife was somehow lesser. Sure, humans had achieved faster-than-light travel and joined the Galactic Federation, but that didn't change the fact that most alien species viewed Earth as the equivalent of a quaint backwater planet where life had somehow stumbled its way into sentience. A gentle tap on his right arm interrupted his brooding. The sensation was familiar, like being poked by a soap bubble that refused to pop. It was Pip, the friendly bubbloid who'd become something of a study buddy over the past few months. Unlike most of their classmates, Pip seemed genuinely curious about Earth and its inhabitants, even if their method of showing it was uniquely bubbloid. Query, you seem to be experiencing emotional displacement. Observation, your facial muscles are conducting the pattern they display when you're suppressing irritation. Additional observation, your core temperature has increased by 0.3 degrees. Suggestion. Perhaps share Earth hunting methods. Addendum, I find your planet's approaches fascinating, even if they lack psychic components. Kelvin couldn't help but smile. He'd grown fond of Pip's direct communication style, even if it sometimes sounded like a particularly emotional computer trying to process feelings. The bubbloid's transparent form shifted through gentle pastel hues, their species' way of showing friendly concern. Not displaced, Kelvin whispered back, just thinking about some things back home that would make today's lecture a bit more interesting. Ah yes, Professor Nick's Quantum's voice cut through their whispered conversation like a laser through fog. Mr. Parker, since you find my lecture on superior hunting methods so engaging that you're having a private discussion, perhaps you'd like to share some examples from your own planet? Something to rival the magnificent spine worm, perhaps. The professor's tone made it clear this was meant to be embarrassing. The slight violet tinge to his gelatinous form suggested he was already savoring what he assumed would be an amusing demonstration of primitive Earth wildlife. After all, what could Earth possibly offer that would compare to psychic hunting techniques? Kelvin straightened in his seat, feeling a smile spread across his face that would have made a great white shark proud. He'd been waiting for this moment since the semester began. Actually, Professor, I would love to tell the class about some of Earth's apex predators. Have you ever heard of a shark? The blank stares he received from everyone, including the professor, told him this was going to be better than he'd hoped. Even Glex had stopped their chromatic preening long enough to look confused, their scales settling into a puzzled shade of green-gray. Shark. Professor Nix Quantum repeated the word like it might bite him, which Kelvin thought with growing amusement was actually a pretty accurate concern. Some sort of primitive creature, I assume? Perhaps a herbivore of some sort. Oh yes, Kelvin replied, unable to keep the grin off his face as he watched Pip's form ripple with anticipation. Very primitive. They've only been around for about 450 million years. Practically brand new, really. And as for being herbivores, he let out a small laugh that made several vapoids condense slightly in concern. The professor's gelatinous form rippled with what might have been uncertainty. He'd just walked into a trap, and somewhere in his floating consciousness he was beginning to realize it. Several of his academic certification bubbles, usually prominently displayed near his upper portion, sank slightly toward his middle. Well then, the professor managed, his usual confidence wavering slightly as Kelvin's grin grew wider. You enlighten us about this shark. Though I must warn you, after our discussion of the spine worm's sophisticated hunting methods, I doubt your Earth creature will prove particularly impressive. Kelvin stood up, his chair making a satisfying screech against the floor that made several of his more sensitive classmates wince. He walked to the front of the class, each step measured and deliberate, and pulled up the holographic display interface. As he did so, he caught Pip's encouraging color shift and Glex's skeptical shimmer. It was time to show these aliens what a real apex predator looked like. And maybe, just maybe, help them understand why humans had not only survived but thrived on a planet that they all considered so soft. As he keyed in his access code to the Xenobiology database, he couldn't help but think that this was going to be a lecture his classmates would never forget. Professor Kelvin said, his finger hovering over the display controls, "Would you like to start with the Great White, or should we work our way up to that?" Professor Nix Quantum's entire form wobbled with what might have been amusement or indigestion. It was always hard to tell with Flotians. Work our way up? Mr. Parker, surely you jest. The specimen you're about to show us can't possibly warrant such a dramatic buildup. The holographic display hummed to life, its crystalline matrix spreading across the front of the lecture hall. Kelvin took a moment to appreciate how every alien in the room had subtly shifted to get a better view. Even the vapoids had condensed into more attentive clouds. Before I begin, Kelvin said, carefully adjusting the display settings, I should probably explain something about Earth's oceans. You see, while you all seem to think Earth is a soft planet. He made air quotes, a gesture that made several of his classmates' visual organs twitch in confusion. Roughly 71% of our surface is covered in water. And not your typical peaceful water bodies. We're talking about vast, deep, often violent oceans. Glex's scales flickered in what Kelvin had learned was their version of a dismissive snort. Water? You're trying to impress us with water? The Zentarian spine worm hunts in quantum probability fields, and you're talking about H2O. Actually, Pip interjected, their surface tension fluctuating with academic excitement. Query Earth's oceans are quite fascinating, are they not? Observation: the pressure differentials in chemical composition create unique evolutionary pressures. Addendum: I've been studying them in my spare time. Professor Nix Quantum waved a gelatinous appendage dismissively. Yes, very quaint. But Mr. Parker, surely you're not suggesting that anything truly remarkable could evolve in such a primitive environment? After all, water is just so basic. Kelvin's smile grew wider. Professor, have you ever wondered why humans developed such a complex fight-or-flight response? Why we're so attuned to movement in our peripheral vision? Why we have an instinctive fear of dark water? The classroom atmosphere shifted subtly. Several students leaned forward, their various sensory organs focused intently on Kelvin. He could see Glex's scales settling into a more serious shade of blue-gray, their earlier dismissiveness giving way to reluctant curiosity. "You see," Kelvin continued, his finger hovering over the display controls, Earth's oceans have been around for about 4.5 billion years. That's 4.5 billion years of evolutionary pressure, of adapt or die scenarios playing out in an environment that covers most of our planet. And in all that time, in all those millions of years of evolution, one family of creatures has remained virtually unchanged, not because they couldn't evolve, but because they didn't need to. They were already perfect. He tapped the control panel, and the first image materialized in the air, a great white shark, mouth open, rows of serrated teeth gleaming. The reaction was immediate and deeply satisfying. Pip's entire form rippled so violently they nearly lost cohesion. 3 vapoids instantly condensed into their solid state from shock. Glex's scales went through every color in their spectrum before settling on a pale, sickly yellow. And Professor Nick's quantum? His gelatinous form actually separated into 2 distinct blobs before hastily reforming. By all that's quantum, the professor managed, his voice coming out in uneven bubbles. "What manner of monstrosity is that?" This Kelvin said innocently, gesturing to the image of one of Earth's most perfect predators. "This is just a regular great white shark. About 6 meters long, 2 tons in weight. Those teeth you're looking at? They're serrated for maximum tissue damage, and if one breaks off, another one just rotates forward to replace it. They have rows and rows of them, like a conveyor belt of death. But Glex's voice had lost all its earlier condescension. Their scales now stuck in that sickly yellow shade. How does it hunt? Surely it uses some form of energy field manipulation, psychic intimidation, quantum entanglement." Kelvin laughed, a sound that made several of his classmates flinch. "Oh no, nothing so complicated. They hunt by smell. They can detect a single drop of blood in 100 liters of water. They use electroreception to sense their prey's heartbeat, and when they attack..." He paused for dramatic effect, noting with satisfaction how the entire class seemed to be holding their various forms of breath. They hit their prey with such force that the impact alone can kill. Those teeth? They're just for tearing the chunks apart afterward. Professor Nick's quantum had regained some of his composure, though his form was still wobbling noticeably. "Surely this must be some sort of apex predator on your world, the pinnacle of your aquatic evolution." "Oh no," Kelvin said cheerfully, switching to the next image, a Megalodon reconstruction. "This is what we consider a modern medium-sized shark. Would you like to see what their ancestors looked like?" The new image filled the holographic display, and this time the reaction was even more dramatic. 2 more vapoids solidified in shock. Glex actually fell out of their hover chair, and Pip's surface tension went so wild they had to quickly encase themselves in a containment field to avoid splattering across the room. That's impossible," Professor Nick's quantum stuttered, his academic credentials now completely scrambled within his form. "No predator could be that. Big," Kelvin suggested helpfully. "Actually, we're not even sure if this is the biggest one. You see, sharks have cartilage instead of bones, so fossilization is rare. We might have had even bigger ones we don't know about yet." The professor's form had started to develop small stress fractures, tiny bubbles breaking off and floating away. But the spine worm, psychic hunting, evolutionary sophistication. "Oh, we haven't even gotten to the really interesting parts yet," Kelvin said, his grin now threatening to split his face. "Would you like to hear about their sensory organs? Or maybe we should talk about their hunting strategies, or..." He paused, watching as the class collectively trembled. "Should I tell you about the ones that hunt in packs?" The silence that followed was broken only by the soft sound of Glex's scales clicking together in terror and the gentle hum of Pip's containment field. Professor Nick's quantum had gone completely still, his usual rippling motion frozen in what appeared to be pure, unadulterated shock. "You see, Professor," Kelvin continued, thoroughly enjoying himself now, while the spine worm was developing its psychic hunting techniques, Earth's sharks were perfecting something far more fundamental. The art of being the perfect killing machine. No psychic powers needed, no quantum fields required. Just millions of years of pure, Evolutionary perfection focused on one single task: predation. He switched to the next image, a compilation of different shark species in hunting mode. And the best part? These are just the sharks. Wait until I tell you about our other predators. The lecture hall erupted into chaos. Several students began frantically accessing their personal databases to fact-check Kelvin's claims. Others were sending urgent messages to their xenobiologist back home. And through it all, Professor Nick's quantum remained frozen, his academic credentials having sunk to the very bottom of his form, where they huddled together like scared fish hiding from a predator. Kelvin glanced at Pip, who had managed to stabilize their surface tension enough to emerge from their containment field. Query. Pip bubbled weakly. Are there more Earth creatures like this? Oh, Pip, Kelvin said, his voice filled with genuine affection for his friend. We're just getting started. Has anyone here ever heard of something called a crocodile? The collective groan of terror that filled the lecture hall was music to his ears. It was going to be a very interesting class indeed. A crocodile. Professor Nick's quantum's voice quavered, his gelatinous form still struggling to recover from the shark revelation. Several of his academic credentials had begun attempting to escape, forcing him to constantly recollect them back into his mass. Perhaps we should return to our scheduled curriculum. Oh, but Professor, Kelvin said, his voice dripping with innocent enthusiasm, you specifically asked me to share Earth's hunting methods. It would be academically irresponsible to stop now, wouldn't it? He turned to the class with a grin that made several students recoil. Besides, I haven't even finished with sharks yet. Pip, who had finally stabilized their surface tension, formed a small questioning bubble. Query. There's more? Observation. Your expression indicates significant anticipation. Concern. Should I reinforce my containment field? Probably, Kelvin replied cheerfully, tapping the holographic controls. Because now we're going to talk about specialized hunting techniques. Professor, you mentioned how sophisticated the spine worm's psychic hunting method is. Let me show you something interesting. The display shifted to show a killer whale, technically a dolphin, but Kelvin figured he'd save that revelation for later, launching itself onto a beach to catch a seal. The class erupted in a cacophony of horrified reactions. Two of the crystallians actually cracked slightly. This, Kelvin announced, speaking over the chaos, is what we call beach hunting these particular sharks. Well, technically they're not sharks, but that's a whole other fascinating discussion. Will deliberately strand themselves on land to catch prey. Then they just wiggle back into the water. They purposely leave their natural environment. To hunt, Glex's scales had locked into a pale greenish white, their usual iridescent display completely forgotten. That's primitive, Kelvin suggested helpfully. Unsophisticated? Because let me tell you about something even better. Breaching, he switched the display to show a great white shark launching its entire body out of the water, a seal in its jaws. Sometimes they hit their prey with so much force that they launch themselves completely out of the water. The impact force can be up to 40 times the force of gravity. Professor Nick's quantum had begun to develop stress ripples across his surface. Mr. Parker, surely these are exceptional cases. Rare hunting methods used only in desperate circumstances. Oh no, Professor. These are just Tuesday for them. Would you like to hear about the cookie cutter shark? It's quite small, actually only about 20 centimeters long. Several students visibly relaxed at this information. Kelvin's grin widened. It gets its name because it latches onto larger prey and literally drills perfectly circular chunks out of them. Like a cookie cutter, they've been known to attack submarines. Submarines? Pip vibrated in confusion. Query. You mean your aquatic vessels? Clarification required. These small creatures attack your technology. They sure do. They bite right through the rubber coverings on submarines. We had to develop special shark-resistant materials because of them. Kelvin paused thoughtfully. Though that's nothing compared to what great whites can do. There was this researcher named Rodney Fox who survived a great white attack. Would you like to hear about his experience? The professor's form rippled in alarm. Mr. Parker, perhaps we should. He required 462 stitches, Kelvin continued enthusiastically. The shark literally split him open from shoulder to waist, exposing several of his organs. And you know what the really interesting part is? He went on to become a shark researcher and conservationist. We humans find them fascinating. The class had gone completely silent, every alien student staring at him with various expressions of horror. Even the vapoids, usually in constant motion, had become unnaturally still. But let's talk about something really interesting: shark intelligence. You see, they're social creatures. They learn from each other. They can solve problems. Some species hunt in packs, coordinating their attacks like military units. He switched the display to show a group of sharks working together to herd fish. They've even been known to learn from failed hunting attempts and adapt their strategies. They learn. Professor Nick's Quantum's voice was barely a whisper. They coordinate. Oh yes. And they remember. They can remember successful hunting grounds for years. Some scientists believe they might even have social hierarchies and complex relationships within their groups. All this without any psychic abilities or quantum fields, just pure, efficient evolution. Glex, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke up. But surely they have weaknesses, limitations. Well, Kelvin pretended to think deeply. They do have to swim constantly to breathe. Except for the species that don't. Some can just lie on the bottom and pump water over their gills. And some species can survive in fresh water too. We call those bull sharks. They swim up rivers sometimes. One was found 2,800 miles up the Amazon River. A crystallian student in the back actually shattered one of their auxiliary crystals in shock. They invade land-based water systems. Invade is such a strong word, Kelvin said, switching to a new image of a bull shark in murky river water. They're just very adaptable. In fact, that's one of the most interesting things about sharks: their adaptability. Some species can survive in practically freezing waters, others in tropical seas. Some hunt in the deepest parts of the ocean, others in shallow coastal waters. There's even a species that can walk on land for short distances. The professor's form had begun to lose cohesion around the edges. Walk. On land. The epaulette shark. It uses its fins to walk across coral reefs and tide pools. It can survive out of water for up to 2 hours. Fascinating creatures, really. Would you like to see a video? No, the collective shout from the class was almost deafening. Well, if you're sure, Kelvin said, trying to hide his amusement. Though I should mention that everything I've shown you so far, these are just our modern sharks. Would you like to hear about megalodons now? They were quite a bit bigger. Their teeth alone were the size of dinner plates. Pip's surface tension had reached such a critical point that they were now perfectly spherical. Query these creatures. They're extinct, correct? Hopeful observation, you use past tense. Oh, megalodons are extinct, yes, but that's the really interesting thing about extinction on Earth. You see, every time a major predator goes extinct, something else usually evolves to fill that ecological niche. Nature abhors a vacuum, after all. In fact, that reminds me of something fascinating about the deep ocean. We've only explored about 5% of it. Who knows what's still down there? The classroom erupted into chaos again. Several students began frantically accessing Earth's planetary defense protocols. Others were sending urgent messages to their species' diplomatic corps. Professor Nick's Quantum had given up trying to maintain his usual professional shape, and it settled into something resembling a worried puddle. But you know what the really interesting part is, Kelvin continued, his voice cutting through the panic. Sharks aren't even our most dangerous predators. They're not even in the top 5. Would you like to hear about something we call the saltwater crocodile? Or maybe we should discuss honey badgers? Or we could talk about our tiny little friends, the bullet ants. Mr. Parker, Professor Nick's Quantum managed to reform enough of his mass to speak. Are you suggesting that your planet has even more dangerous creatures than these? Sharks. Professor. Kelvin replied, his grin now reaching truly worrying proportions. We haven't even started on our venomous species yet. Did you know we have a spider that can kill you in under an hour? And it loves hiding in shoes. We call it the Sydney funnel web spider. The funnel web part is because of how it traps its prey. The Sydney part is because it's from Australia, which is a whole other level of evolutionary warfare that I think deserves its own lecture. The sound of multiple alien students fainting in various species-specific ways filled the lecture hall. Glix had gone completely chrome in terror, their scales losing all color. Pip had started generating small distress bubbles that popped with tiny whimpers. But perhaps, Kelvin said, saving his presentation with a flourish, we should save Australia for another day. After all, we wouldn't want to overwhelm anyone with too much information about Earth's wildlife at once, would we? Professor Nick's Quantum's only response was a weak bubbling sound as his academic credentials tried once again to escape his mass. The lecture hall had descended into a state of shocked silence, broken only by the occasional whimper and the soft sound of crystalline stress fracturing. Kelvin looked at his stunned audience and decided that maybe, just maybe, they were finally ready to hear about what humans had evolved from. But that, he decided, was definitely a presentation for another day. After all, he still hadn't told them about the octopus. The silence in the lecture hall was broken by a small, terrified voice from the back of the room. One of the crystallians had raised a faceted appendage, their usually luminescent form dimmed to an anxious opacity. "Mr. Parker, you mentioned octopi." Kelvin's face lit up with genuine delight. "Oh yes, they're absolutely fascinating. You see, while sharks are incredible predators, they're actually quite straightforward in their hunting methods. Octopi, on the other hand." He paused, noting how the class collectively tensed. "They're problem solvers." Professor Nick's Quantum had managed to reform most of his mass, though his academic credentials remained huddled at his base. Problem solvers. Exactly. Kelvin enthusiastically tapped the holographic controls. They can unscrew jar lids to get food, they can solve puzzles, they can use tools. Some have been observed collecting coconut shells to use as portable shelters. They're essentially living supercomputers with arms. The display showed an octopus deftly manipulating various objects, solving complex puzzles, and changing colors to match its surroundings. The alien students watched in horrified fascination as the creature demonstrated intelligence that rivaled some of their own species' capabilities. "But here's the really interesting part," Kelvin continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone sharing a particularly juicy secret. "We're not entirely sure how intelligent they are because they only live for about 3 to 5 years. They die right after mating. Imagine what they could achieve if they lived as long as humans." Pip, who had been generating a steady stream of worried bubbles, formed a question mark shape. "Query these creatures. They have no internal support structure? Observation, their morphological plasticity seems impossible." "That's right," Kelvin beamed. "They can fit through any hole larger than their beak. We once had one escape from an aquarium through a hole the size of a coin. It would regularly leave its tank at night to eat fish from other exhibits, then return before morning. The staff couldn't figure out how the fish were disappearing until they set up cameras." The class erupted into horrified murmurs. Glex's scales had started making a high-pitched keening sound. But that's not possible. How can a creature be both intelligent and physically adaptable to that degree? "Oh, that's nothing," Kelvin said, waving dismissively. "Wait until you hear about their venom. The blue-ringed octopus, for instance, it's tiny, beautiful, and its venom can kill a human in minutes. No known antidote. And the best part, it's so small you might not even notice it's there until it's too late." Professor Nick's Quantum had begun to develop stress fractures across his surface. "Mr. Parker, perhaps we should return to discussing more conventional predators." "Excellent suggestion." Professor Kelvin's enthusiasm made several students flinch. "Let's talk about bears. You see, most predators are specialists. They evolve to fill specific niches. Bears, on the other hand, said why choose and decided to eat basically everything." The holographic display shifted to show a grizzly bear standing on its hind legs. 3 vapoids immediately dissipated in terror and had to be collected by their classmates. This, Kelvin gestured to the image, is what we call an opportunistic omnivore. It can fish, hunt, forage, and if necessary, it can just decide to raid our food storage facilities. They're strong enough to flip cars, smart enough to open doors, and some species have learned to use rocks as tools. They approach human settlements. A gelatinous student in the back had started to crystallize from anxiety. "Oh yes. In fact, we have a saying, a fed bear is a dead bear, because once they learn they can get food from humans, they keep coming back. We have to use special bear-proof containers in many areas. Though to be fair, sometimes the bears figure those out too." The display changed to show a polar bear. "Now this is interesting, the largest land-based predator on Earth. They actively hunt humans given the chance. They're so dangerous that in some areas it's illegal to leave your house without a weapon capable of stopping one." The class had gone deathly quiet. Even the ambient sounds of various alien physiologies had ceased. Kelvin could practically hear their collective horror growing. "But you know what's really fascinating about Earth's predators? The size of a creature has absolutely no correlation with how dangerous it is. Take the wolverine, for instance. It's relatively small, but it will fight a bear for food, and usually win. He switched the display to show a compilation of various predators. We have wolves that hunt in highly coordinated packs using tactics that military strategists study. We have big cats that can crush turtle shells with their jaws. We have eagles that can see a rabbit from 3 kilometers away and dive at speeds that would make some spacecraft envious. Mr. Parker, Professor Nix Quantum interrupted, his form now resembling a worried waterfall. Are you suggesting that your planet's surface is completely covered in deadly predators? Oh no, Professor Kelvin replied with a smile that made the entire class lean back. Some of our deadliest creatures are actually quite small. Consider the box jellyfish. It's nearly invisible in water, and its venom is one of the most potent in the world. Or the inland taipan snake. A single bite contains enough venom to kill 100 humans. Or my personal favorite, the parasitic wasps that lay their eggs inside other insects, allowing their larvae to eat their way out. The crystallian who had asked about octopi earlier made a sound like breaking glass. Several students had begun accessing Earth's travel advisory warnings, while others were frantically updating their species databases about the Deathworld they had previously dismissed as soft. But you know what the really interesting thing is, Kelvin continued, his voice taking on a thoughtful tone that somehow made everything worse. Humans? We evolved alongside all of these creatures. Every single one of these predators helped shape our species. We learned, we adapted, and eventually he grinned, and this time even Pip retreated into their containment field. We became something even they had to fear. Query Pip's voice came out as a terrified bubble. Are you suggesting that humans are apex predators? Oh yes. But we're a very special kind. You see, most predators evolve to be specialists. Sharks are perfect aquatic predators, big cats are perfect ambush hunters, bears are perfect opportunists. But humans, he paused for dramatic effect. We learned from all of them. The holographic display shifted to show various human activities: hunting, fishing, farming, building. We can swim like sharks, though not as well. We can run like wolves, though not as fast. We can climb like big cats, though not as gracefully. We can use tools like octopi, though our arms aren't as flexible. We took every successful predator strategy on Earth and combined them, and then we did something none of them could do. What? What did humans do? Professor Nix Quantum asked, though his rippling form suggested he already regretted the question. We improved on them. We made better tools, better strategies, better ways of hunting. We learned to work together in larger groups than any wolf pack. We figured out how to preserve food better than any catching bear. We developed communication more complex than any dolphin pod. And most importantly, Kelvin's voice dropped to a near whisper that somehow carried through the entire hall. We learned how to pass all of that knowledge on to the next generation. The silence that followed was profound. Every alien student was processing the horrifying revelation that humans weren't just another spacefaring species, they were the ultimate predator from a planet of ultimate predators. So you see, Professor Kelvin concluded, his voice cheerful once again, when you dismissed Earth as a soft planet, you weren't just underestimating our wildlife. You were underestimating the species that evolved to survive alongside it. He paused, checking the time. I suppose we should save the discussion about human endurance hunting for another day. After all, we wouldn't want to overwhelm anyone with too much information at once, would we? The sound of multiple alien students simultaneously accessing their species' diplomatic protocols filled the air. Professor Nix Quantum had completely lost cohesion and was slowly seeping under his desk. And through it all, Kelvin stood at the front of the class, wearing the smile of a species that had earned its place at the top of a food chain that would give most aliens nightmares. Oh, and one more thing, he added, almost as an afterthought. Everything I've shown you today? That's just what we know about. Remember what I said about only exploring 5% of our oceans? He winked at Pip, who had generated so many stress bubbles they looked like a foam machine. Sweet dreams, everyone. The next day, Kelvin walked into Advanced Xenobiology to find the classroom dynamics had shifted dramatically. The usual scattered seating arrangement had been replaced by what could only be described as species-based survival clusters. Most notably, there was a conspicuous 3-meter empty radius around his usual seat. Query permission to maintain previous proximity. Pip's voice came from nearby, their form hovering uncertainly at their usual spot next to Kelvin's desk. Additional query: promise not to demonstrate any predatory behaviors during today's session. Kelvin couldn't help but smile. I promise not to eat anyone during class, Pip. Clarification that was not technically a denial of all predatory behaviors, Pip noted, but settled into their seat anyway, though their containment field remained actively humming. Professor Nix Quantum's entrance was markedly different from his usual confident float. His gelatinous form seemed to be trying to maintain as much density as possible, his usually dispersed academic credentials now tightly clustered in a defensive formation. He had also positioned his hover podium to maintain maximum distance from Kelvin's seat. Today's lesson, the professor began, his voice bubbling with barely contained anxiety, will cover the peaceful grazing habits of the fluttering mist wisps of Xenon VII. A completely harmless species with no natural predators or defensive capabilities whatsoever. Kelvin raised his hand. The entire class flinched. Yes, Mr. Parker, the professor's form rippled with visible dread. Though I must insist that any Earth-related comparisons be submitted in writing, with appropriate warning labels. Actually, Professor, I was just going to point out that a complete lack of defensive capabilities seems like a significant evolutionary oversight. On Earth, even our plants have developed defense mechanisms. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Glex's scales clicking in terror. From the back of the room, one of the Vapoids whispered, even their vegetation is combat-ready. Well, yes, Kelvin said, warming to the subject. Take the manchineel tree, for example. Every part of it is so toxic that standing under it during rain can cause chemical burns. Or the Jimpy plant, its sting is so painful that there are documented cases of humans going mad from it. Some horses have committed suicide after being stung. A Crystallian student fractured slightly. Your planet's flora actively drives creatures to self-termination. Oh, that's not even the interesting part, Kelvin continued cheerfully. You see, some plants have developed complex chemical warfare systems. They can release pheromones to warn other plants of danger, call in predatory insects for defense, or even sense when they're being eaten and increase their toxicity in response. Professor Nix Quantum's form had started to develop stress ripples again. Mr. Parker, perhaps we could save the discussion of Earth's chemical warfare flora for never. Of course, Professor. Though I should mention that the fluttering mist wisps might want to develop some defenses. Nature abhors a vacuum, after all. On Earth, we've found that completely defenseless species tend to. Well, let's just say they don't stay defenseless for long, or they don't stay. The class had gone completely silent. Several students were frantically taking notes, presumably updating their species databases about Earth's combat-evolved ecosystem. Query Pip ventured, their surface tension fluctuating with morbid curiosity. How do humans survive in such an environment? Oh, that's simple, Kelvin replied with a grin that made several students lean away. We learned from everything that tried to kill us. Those toxic plants, we studied them and developed medicines. Those predators, we observed their hunting techniques and improved upon them. Even the microorganisms that tried to kill us, we turned them into antibiotics. A small voice from the back of the room asked, You weaponized the organisms that attempted to eliminate you. Weaponized is such a strong word, Kelvin said thoughtfully. We prefer adapted, though I suppose from a certain perspective, humans are basically walking collections of every successful survival strategy Earth has ever produced. We're what you get when you take all those lethal adaptations and add abstract thinking. Professor Nix Quantum had given up trying to teach and was now simply hovering in place, his academic credentials huddled together like scared children. Mr. Parker, are you suggesting that humans are essentially the evolutionary endpoint of a death world? Endpoint, Kelvin laughed, causing several students to solidify, vaporize, or crystallize in fear. Oh no, Professor, we're still evolving. After all, what's the next logical step after mastering your own planet's predatory adaptations? The implications hung in the air like a heavy fog. Several students began accessing their species' updated diplomatic protocols regarding Earth. But don't worry, Kelvin added cheerfully, we come in peace. Mostly. Unless you try to take our coffee. Then all bets are off. Coffee Glex's scales had shifted to a curious shade of green. What manner of chemical weapon is that? It's not a weapon, Kelvin explained. It's a beverage we make from roasted beans. Though I suppose it is technically a psychoactive compound that we've become dependent on. We tend to get a bit cranky without it. Query: your species deliberately addicted itself to a psychoactive compound. For pleasure, Pip's surface tension had reached previously unknown levels of stress. Well, when you put it that way, it sounds bad, Kelvin admitted. Though that's nothing compared to what we did with capsaicin. What? What is capsaicin? Professor Nix Quantum asked, immediately regretting the question. Oh, it's a chemical compound some plants developed as a defense mechanism. It causes burning pain when consumed. So naturally, we decided to selectively breed the plants to make it stronger and then turn it into a condiment. We literally take plants that evolved to cause us pain and put them on our food because we enjoy the sensation. The classroom erupted into chaos again. Several students began drafting urgent messages to their homeworld suggesting a reevaluation of human psychology. Glex's scales had locked into a pattern that seemed to be trying to spell out why in various alien languages. But perhaps Kelvin said, noting the time, we should save the discussion about human dietary habits for another day. Though I must say, Professor, I'm looking forward to next week's lecture on evolution. I have some fascinating insights about Australia's contribution to natural selection. Professor Nix Quantum's form briefly lost all cohesion before he managed to pull himself together enough to dismiss the class. As students fled the room in various states of existential crisis, Pip lingered behind. Query: are all humans like you? Kelvin considered this for a moment. No, I suppose not. Some of us are much more interested in extreme sports. Would you like to hear about free solo climbing? Pip's only response was to generate a series of increasingly distressed bubbles before rapidly exiting the classroom, leaving Kelvin alone with his thoughts and the faint sound of various alien species updating their threat assessment protocols in the hallway outside. He gathered his things, humming cheerfully. After all, tomorrow's class was about environmental adaptation, and he had some very interesting points to make about how humans had turned every hostile environment on Earth into a potential vacation spot. But that, he decided, was definitely a presentation for another day. Word of Kelvin's presentations had spread through the Galactic Academy like a quantum wave collapse. By the following week, his Advanced Xenobiology class had acquired an unexpected audience. The observation galleries, usually empty, were packed with faculty members, xenobiologists from various worlds, and more than a few diplomatic observers. Professor Nix Quantum, who had apparently spent the weekend restructuring his molecular density for improved stability, managed to maintain a mostly solid form as he began the class. Today's lecture will cover environmental adaptation strategies across known worlds. We'll begin with the gentle climate modifications of... Actually, Professor Kelvin interrupted, raising his hand with a smile that made several observers activate their emergency containment fields. I've been doing some research about environmental adaptation, and I had a few questions about Australia. The entire room went still. In the observation gallery, someone dropped a data pad. Australia. Professor Nix Quantum's form rippled with dread. The continental region you mentioned previously. Exactly. Kelvin's enthusiasm was palpable. You see, I've been thinking about our discussion of evolutionary pressures, and Australia is really the perfect case study. It's like nature decided to create a contained experiment in escalating deadliness. Pip, who had upgraded their containment field to military-grade specifications, formed a hesitant question mark. Query: is this the same Australia that contains the suicide-inducing plant? The Jimpy. Oh yes, but that's hardly the most interesting thing there. You see, Australia has been isolated from other continents for millions of years, so it's developed some unique evolutionary solutions. A crystalline diplomat in the observation gallery began to develop stress fractures. Unique? How? Well, Kelvin said, pulling up the holographic display with what could only be described as malicious glee. Let's start with something simple. The platypus. The image that appeared caused several gasps and at least one diplomatic incident as a junior ambassador accidentally transmitted an emergency signal to their homeworld. Now I know what you're thinking, Kelvin continued. It looks like someone took spare parts from various animals and stuck them together. But here's the fun part: male platypuses are venomous. The venom causes pain so severe that morphine doesn't help, and the pain can last for months. Months. Professor Nix Quantum's academic credentials had started trying to escape again. From a single envenomation. Oh yes. But that's just the mammals. Would you like to hear about the birds? There's this lovely creature called the cassowary. It's basically a modern dinosaur with anger management issues. They can disembowel a human with a single kick. In the back of the room, a vapoid student condensed so rapidly they had to be collected with a special vacuum device. But the really interesting ones are the insects and arachnids, Kelvin added, his grin reaching new levels of concerning. For instance, we have these lovely ants called jack jumpers. If they sting you, there's a chance you'll develop an allergic reaction so severe that you can die within minutes without treatment. Query Pip's voice wavered. These are the small insects you mentioned previously? The ones that work in coordinated groups. Exactly. Though they're nothing compared to our spiders. Did you know we have a spider that can kill you in under 15 minutes? And it loves human habitation. They especially like hiding in shoes. The observation gallery had gone completely silent. Several xenobiologists were frantically updating their databases, while others appeared to be drafting resignation letters. But you know what's really fascinating about Australia? Kelvin continued, clearly enjoying himself. The saltwater crocodiles. They're the largest reptilian predators on Earth, and they're smart. They learn patterns, they can plan ambushes, and they've been known to use tools. Tools a brave soul from the diplomatic corps squeaked. They use sticks to lure birds. They've learned that birds use sticks for nesting, so during nesting season, the crocodiles balance sticks on their snouts and wait. When a bird comes to collect the stick, Kelvin made a snapping motion that caused several observers to faint. Professor Nick's quantum had given up trying to maintain his professional shape and had settled into something resembling a worried puddle. Mr. Parker, perhaps we should return to discussing less lethal environments. Oh, but Professor, I haven't even gotten to the box jellyfish yet. Or the blue-ringed octopus. Or the cone snails. Did you know we have snails that can kill you? They fire a venomous harpoon that can penetrate protective gear. The room had descended into a state of collective horror. Even the most seasoned xenobiologists were showing signs of stress in their various physiological ways. But you know what the really interesting part is? Kelvin's voice took on a thoughtful tone that somehow made everything worse. Humans didn't just survive in Australia, we thrived there. In fact, the indigenous peoples of Australia developed such a deep understanding of the environment that they could use these deadly creatures to their advantage. They turned what you'd consider a death world into a home. A small voice from the observation gallery asked, "How? How did humans achieve this?" "Oh, that's simple," Kelvin replied cheerfully. "We learned, we adapted. We figured out which plants could kill us and which could heal us. We learned to read the environment, to understand the behaviors of the creatures around us. And most importantly," he paused for dramatic effect, "we learned to surf." Surf? Professor Nick's quantum managed to reform enough to ask the question. "Yes, surf. You see, in waters filled with sharks, jellyfish, and various other deadly creatures, humans decided the logical thing to do was to invent a sport where we ride waves on small boards. For fun. Sometimes we even do it at night." The silence that followed was profound. Every alien being in the room was processing the implications of a species that would voluntarily enter predator-filled waters in the dark for entertainment. Of course, Kelvin added, almost as an afterthought, "That's nothing compared to what we do with the box jellyfish season. Some beaches just put up warning signs and people still go swimming. We call it living dangerously. It's quite popular, actually." The sound of multiple emergency communications being sent to various homeworlds filled the air. The diplomatic corps had largely given up on maintaining composure and were openly updating their species protocols regarding human interaction. But perhaps, Kelvin concluded with a smile that would haunt several alien species' collective nightmares, we should save the discussion about human recreational activities for another time. Though I must say, Professor, I'm looking forward to next semester's class on interspecies psychology. I have some fascinating insights about how humans turned wolves into dogs because we thought they'd make good friends. The class ended in chaos. Professor Nick's quantum had to be collected in a specialized containment vessel. The diplomatic corps declared an emergency session to reassess human classification in the Galactic database. And through it all, Kelvin packed up his things, humming a cheerful tune. As he left the classroom, Pip floated nervously beside him. "Final query, is there anything on your planet that isn't trying to kill you?" Kelvin thought for a moment. "Well, there are quokkas. They're probably the only creatures in Australia that don't want to kill everything. They're actually quite friendly. Would you like to see a picture? Pip cautiously extended a sensory tendril toward Kelvin's datapad, then immediately retracted it. Observation, it's smiling. Concern on your planet. Is that a warning sign? No, Pip. Kelvin laughed, causing several passing aliens to dive for cover. Sometimes a smile is just a smile. Though now that you mention it, I should probably tell you about dolphins. The sound of Pip's containment field activating at maximum power echoed through the hallway as Kelvin walked away, already planning his next presentation. After all, someone had to explain to these aliens why humans had decided to keep venomous snakes as pets. But that, he decided, was definitely a story for another day. In the administrative offices of the Galactic Academy, a new classification was being added to the database: Earth Classification Extreme Caution. Note: everything on this planet, including the plants, weather, and geography, should be considered potentially lethal. Additional note: the dominant species thinks this is normal and occasionally seeks out additional danger for fun. Final note: they made friends with wolves. Exercise maximum diplomatic courtesy.